A very good day and welcome to this roundtable with Roger Jardine, held under the theme Getting the 1994 Democratic Project Back on Track. My name is Nzinga Kunta and I'm so pleased to be hosting this conversation with a range of bright minds from across industries here in South Africa, taking a look at not only the challenges we face, but I think more importantly, possible solutions to those. We are well aware of the crises that grip our country: poverty, inequality and unemployment broadly. So, what's to be done and who's going to do this? Joining me today, Dr. Thokozani Chilenga Botoa, a lecturer in the Department of Political Studies at Wits University, Rekhotsofetse Chikane, an advocate for socio-economic equality, Dr. Sizwe Mpofu Walsh, a South African author, musician and activist, Sonqaba Vuba, an actual science BSc honours graduate from Wits University, and Carl Kleinhans, who heads up diversity, an investor in well-located affordable housing precincts in South Africa, as well as Roger Jardine. Roger, perhaps I'm going to start with you. If you can just give us insight into when you stepped down from the First Rand board, you said you wanted to speak about the social conditions in South Africa and move in there. Tell me about that and who you are as well.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you to all of our panelists today for coming. I was born in a place called Rivoli, which is just to the western side of Johannesburg, and then my family moved to Eldorado Park. And I was part of a generation that resisted apartheid and was so proud to be part of that history, and then in 1994 to be part of that transition. I was in the public service as a Director General. And for the last almost 25 years, I've been in the private sector. And as South Africa has evolved from that 1994 moment, I've continued to think about the journey that I was on. And with the situation as it is today, I've come to the conclusion that it's time to change course. That's why I decided to step off the board of First Rand and to play a part in South Africa's future development. But most importantly, I was a young person at the time, and I think for our generation who fought against apartheid and helped to build a post-apartheid South Africa, given where we are today, it is time for us to step forward and to work with the younger generation to now chart the future together. So I have taken this step, and I'm looking forward to listening, to learning, to sharing with young people on what the future should look like, because I think only that way we'll be able to move forward.
If you had to say what the most urgent issue facing South Africa is right now, what would you say that is?
I think we have a range of urgent issues, whether it's crime, healthcare, grandmother sitting in the sun waiting for pension payouts. There's a whole range of things. But right now, and this is really part of what inspires me and motivates me, I think it's time for South Africans, like-minded South Africans, to come together so that we can move into the future together. The most urgent thing that we need to do is to rally together to take South Africa to a different place. And I think from that will flow solutions to the myriad of issues that we're currently facing.
Mm-hmm. I think, Dr. Chilenga Botoa, I'm going to take this question to you and then the rest of our panelists here. If you had to answer that, what's the most pressing issue that we're facing in South Africa? And because I'd like us to look at our challenges, but also our solutions, so we're not always diagnosing where we are in South Africa, but actually, how do we get to the better place?
I think the most pressing issue we have is uncertainty in every sector, whether it's due to the energy crisis, whether it's due to worrying about our education system, basic education system, and how many children or learners are going to get through the system in order to contribute meaningfully to South Africa. We face uncertainty on all fronts. And I think what we need is definitely cohesion and to come together and ask what points as different South Africans can we converge on. So across class, across race, across different groupings, how is it that we can converge, and how can we be strategic in that conversion? Does it mean that, or in that convergence, sorry, does it mean that we need more local level activity? Does it mean that we need to support different causes but in a more strategic way so that we can get to the solutions that we need? Because I don't think that in the post-1994 moment that we're in now, there is one solution. So how do we converge so that we can meet these different crises that create uncertainty in order to then move forward as a country?
As a researcher or someone who's very concerned with what's taking place in South Africa, what would you say has led us to this point?
To this current situation,
Yeah.
so many things. I think there was a very important moment in 1994, this moment of liberation, this moment of freedom. There was then a subsequent 10 years of how do we then make this freedom work? And then there's a realization the next 10 years of making freedom work is really, really hard. And then 10 years of people actively trying to take those freedoms away. You know, actively chipping away at democratic institutions, whether it's Chapter 9 institutions, whether it's the National Prosecuting Authority, whether it is underfunding the SAPs, whether it is the ISS has this fantastic stat of that the budget of the Hawks is less than the budget for the protective services of ministers, right? So there's this chipping away at democratic institutions. And I think that's the situation that we find ourselves in now, of South Africans then having to then comprehend, well, what do we do now? I think people have been listening to everyone in the country for years. I don't think listening is necessarily a fundamental problem. It's about what do you do with the views that people give you. Do you respect the views? Political parties, generally speaking, aren't incentivized to be responsive to citizens' views. So if a citizen says, there's no water in my community, there's no fear of God instilled in a political party to say, well, I have to then go fix this water, otherwise I won't be here. When that incentive structure breaks down, then you could listen to as many people, you could have as many platforms as possible, but the structures in place ensure that that never translates into change. And as we were saying earlier on, that then creates a system where people then ask the question of, then what's the point? Why should I do this? I now know the rules of the game. I can see what's taking place. And once you have that situation, the question then becomes, do you keep batting at I was going to say students, do you start batting down at citizens saying, you must just do more, you should just vote? Or do you ask the question of how do we change the rules of the game? And that's a governance change, that's a system-wide change, but that's my view on that.
Okay. Dr. Mpofu-Walsh, if we hear about that governance change or systems being dealt with, often a conversation that arises is, people from the private sector should just take over and come in because there's efficiency that comes with that. But we also know that the private sector, as we've seen in the headlines in the recent weeks, can sometimes be the cause for governance challenges in our country if we're looking at the manipulation of the rand and currencies and the like. So just tell me, how do the private and public sector work better together, and is there someone going to rescue us from there?
Thanks very much, Nzinga. Roger and fellow panelists, glad to be with you. I think because we have so many multiple intersecting crises, and because the private sector is seen as this island of efficiency, our first move is to stem the bleeding by turning to the private sector. And in some ways, I think that is a reasonable short-term solution. If there's no capacity in the state in Transnet or in Eskom, we rush to the private sector, at least import that capacity into the state and stop the immediate crisis. But I think we need to think long and hard about what that could mean for our democracy, because in the long term, the democratic accountability that is supposed to exist between citizens and the government gets eroded when the private sector starts playing an increasing role in the functions of the state. And so our capacity as citizens to hold government accountable becomes undermined by an increased role of the private in the state. And so I'm worried that in the short term, an increased role for the private sector in our state. It's almost as if rather than state participation in the economy, we now have business participation in the state. And we need to think long and hard about the long-term consequences of that. Ultimately, it's about building a state that doesn't need to rest and lean on the private sector. And I think we probably have to have a transition period where once we've stabilized our multiple crises, our first port of call is re-stabilizing the state and regenerating that direct link between citizens and the government.
Carl, we know that if we're going to have a well-functioning state, it also goes down to well-functioning cities. They're a major conduit for growth in a country. How do we get our cities and metros back to performing at those required levels that we need and becoming those engines of growth that were envisaged in 1994?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I was thinking about, as you were asking some of the panelists earlier, what they think the biggest crises are that are facing South Africa, and I certainly agree with all the issues that have been raised so far. The one that's particularly close to my heart is the spatial form of our cities and the way in which that the spatial legacy of apartheid, almost 30 years into the new South Africa, is still fundamentally undermining our society's ability to move forward and really get on with it. There's so many ways in which this problem manifests, but I was just recently reading some research that Treasury had published actually about labour market failure in South Africa, and specifically insofar as it relates to youth unemployment. And we as a society really stand out in the world in terms of our youth unemployment. Like, it is a very unusually high amount of youth unemployment. You could go to countries that are far less developed than South Africa across the continent, but you'll find that way more young people work than practically, whether it be in a formal or formal capacity, but they are doing something. This work that Treasury had done shows quite robustly how the spatial form of our cities, and basically, to put it bluntly, the fact that low wage and typically previously disadvantaged individuals are so far away from everything, because that's where we build RDP housing and state subsidized housing, is essentially making it impossible for those people to afford to look for work. It's that simple, right? If you live at the back end of Orange Farm, which is, we're sitting somewhere fairly central in Joburg right now, that's probably a 45-minute commute from here when there's no traffic, hour and 20-minute commute, early in the morning when you're on your way to work. So and that's if you can afford it in the first place, right? South Africans spend a third of their disposable income on transport, which is something we get nothing for. It's a pure cost. So, I could keep going and link this spatial challenge that we have in the way in which our cities have been developed in South Africa in the last 3 years, and obviously stemming from a long history of spatial segregation prior to that, and link that back to almost any developmental challenge that you can think of. Take early childhood development as an example. A child growing up in a household where their parents need to leave for work before they even get up in the morning and get home late at night after they've probably come home from school and gone to bed, will have very different educational outcomes to a child whose parents can be present in their life, right? Because they live close to where the kid goes to school and where they work. Similar with everything from gender-based violence to primary healthcare outcomes. All of these issues that we see symptomatically in our society somehow are drawn back to the spatial fabric of our cities and the way in which they have been through decades of spatial policy unfortunately been sprawled in this manner. So I don't want to say that is the challenge facing our cities, but it's certainly the one that I'm very passionate about and working on, and our business is one of these private sector institutions that are stepping into a void where government is presently failing to provide the necessary services by providing well-located, affordable accommodation to specifically these households. But I guess our hope as a business is that in time, through doing what we do, we can inspire government to join us and really ultimately take over from us in developing housing for low-wage members of our society in a manner that is more befitting, I think, of the kind of society that we want to create.
So Nqaba, as we look at growth and what we're hoping to achieve in getting back to some of that excitement and that potential that we saw in 1994, we also need to look at the risks to South Africa. The World Bank released a report saying basically that crime costs South Africa about 10% of GDP. And so that's such a massive risk to us growing. How do you deal with something that's so almost entrenched in the fabric of who we are as South Africans and how we live.
Yeah, I mean, similar to what Roger said right at the beginning, there's so many issues, right? You can latch on crime, you can latch on unemployment, and I think in a lot of the challenges we face as a country, we're often kind of solving for the symptoms rather than kind of understanding what the root cause issues are. And I think the crime and like GBV are some of those where you can do stuff to solve for the symptom, but if you have not truly understood what the root cause is, and for me personally, I find that we have eroded like dignity for so many people in this country, that there is a prevailing storm of people who do not have self-dignity, do not have self-agency, and are fundamentally victims of whatever the system is. And I truly believe that for me, one of the key factors we've got to get right is around how to reinstate that dignity, how to actually give people a sense of agency over their own lives and being able to actually play a role in what their lives become. Carl just mentioned now about the high rate of youth unemployment. I think like unemployment and youth unemployment specifically is beyond a ticking time bomb. And I think when we talk about crime and we talk about many other challenges and our lack of growth and our lack of stability, a lot of it stems from those type of root cause issues around if we have an inability to appropriately educate people, an inability to provide people human dignity, and an inability to provide people agency over their own ability to be economically active in their own country, where they actually feel like third-class citizens, then we will see many symptoms, crime being some of those, GBV being some of those. And I really think that it's not about getting back to the previous excitement. I think there's a new, renewed excitement that we need to create rather than it is about trying to get back to 94, but about understanding right now as we look at 2024, what is the excitement we need for 2024? Because I think it's fundamentally different that is required next year rather than what was required in 94.
I love that. Roger, you've heard so many views about the challenges that there are, the excitement that there is, the potential that's there as well. How do you even start to deal with that from a leadership point of view if you're a person who wants to be part of resetting South Africa and coming back and bringing some of the dignity that's been spoken about, the excitement, the potential, and harnessing all of that?
Yeah, look, I think you're right. This notion of just listening, I think people are tired of that, right? And the flip side of that is, isn't it really about accountability ultimately? Because the stock response from a voter or a young person in particular is there's a cycle. Okay, people tend to listen more intently the closer the election is. And then it goes away and everyone says, so what, right, Malik? So I think listening and accountability are sort of the twin challenges for somebody who wants to lead a society. Now, the way I would approach it is if you look at the structure of the way we fulfill the dreams and hopes of people, right? We have an executive, which is the government, we have a parliament, and then we have citizenry. And it's not a complete unbroken line in between election cycles, but we're forced into that kind of dynamic, which is why it takes us to the point that you raised about the private sector having to step in, right?
Sure.
I know that the public sector is not the private sector, right? It's not. The truth of the matter is, because of the way this country has been mismanaged, there's a huge gap in the public sector. And so the palliative intervention of the private sector should not be taken for a long-term thing, okay? But ultimately, and I think you were referring to this, Carol, the issue is, can we restructure the way we do things in our country on a firm basis of social solidarity, right? So we all know there are extremely wealthy people and extremely poor people in our society. And how do we, as South Africans, lend a hand to rebuild this country? I don't think we want the nostalgia of 1994. It's 2024 next year, the world has changed, right? Where I think this intergenerational thing can this intergenerational movement can be a force for good is that period embodied certain values about the society we want to be. We are not that society today, right? And culture and values resides in us. It doesn't reside in documents and emails and posters. We live the values and the culture. And so I think for veterans and people like myself who threw stones and waged wars with police and soldiers in the street, this is not the contract that we made, right? But we are here today, so how do we get back on track? And I think this thing of dignity, right? It's at the heart of everything. You go to a hospital, there's a nurse who has struggled all night to save a patient. He or she does not have what they need, okay? It's not rocket science, okay? And the way citizens engage with the state has to change. So I think together we have to fix the state, because the public sector will never play that role. Public sector can provide some palliative care, but the state has to fulfill its constitutional duty, which is clearly set out. And I will be talking a lot about social solidarity into the future, because this crisis moment doesn't demand ideology. It demands practical interventions so that we can deal with the dignity of people. You know, no one's grandmother should sit in the sun waiting for a pension payout, right? No one in 2023 should be drinking water that's riddled with cholera. No child should buy a biscuit and die because the food quality office has been destroyed in a municipality. So how do we join those dots? And that's why I still think the biggest challenge for us is to get like-minded people together in business, in civil society, and the public sector to solve these issues. And there are many issues, but I do think we have to start somewhere.
Mm-hmm. If we're talking about a place to start when it comes to South Africa and this reset of some sort, leadership is obviously going to come to mind. What kind of leader do we need post-2024? And that's open to anybody who's going to take it. I mean, I can take it also.
The type of leader we
Yeah.
need. I don't think we need a leader. There's this, South Africa likes saviors. South Africa doesn't need another big savior. We deify individuals within our political realm around this one person will be the panacea to all our issues. Whether it's Mandela, whether it's Mbeki, whether it's Julius Malema, whether it's Mangosuthu Buthelezi, you have literal political parties like the UDM that solely exist around one personality. If that personality disappears, the party disappears. You need a collective of individuals, so this is where I agree with Roger. You need a collective of individuals across sectors, across political spectrums, who are able to get into a room and discuss with each other without throwing stones at each other. You know, just like an honest conversation to say, we might sit on very different sides of the political spectrum, but no one's going to disagree that unemployment's a problem. So how do we then solve that? No one would fundamentally disagree with Carl to be like, apartheid spatial planning is probably one of the biggest impediments to any sort of development in any community. We then discuss what the modalities are. You just need the type of environment that allows that to happen. What we're seeing, at least in my opinion, is systems like Parliament have become increasingly, I don't want to say like fractious, they just fight over things that don't need to be fought about, if that makes sense. Like, you don't need to fight about whether we agree that unemployment's an issue, or worse off, fighting about inconsequential things, about what should be on the agenda of Parliament for this particular session. And if there was to be an individual, I wouldn't want that individual to come in and say, I am here to save you. When you go into communities and you talk to people don't care about an individual. It's people just want things to work. And that one individual can't fix a pothole by himself. You can't physically go to every single pothole and fix that. You need that collective effort, whether that's including the churches, political parties, civil society. And what I would say to Raj as well is that people have been trying to do this So it's not as if no one's ever tried to come together. Civil society has been banding together and being shut down in multiple different forms, whether it's in the Western Cape. An organization just had a conference of 100 different organizations this week about how to fix this country. But everyone is still in their corners. And I think if there was one person, it wouldn't be how that one person fixes the country, it's about how that one person brings the conversation together. And then we can figure out how to fix the country at that point. So yeah, no, I don't know if you should deify anyone, but if you were, that person's job would be how do you then bring society together.
May I ask what's your question just on that? I'm interested to hear that because if I spoke first, I would have said, oh, we need someone that we can rally behind. But I must say I take Futse's point. So I just want to ask, so what does it look like in practice then? Is it a movement? Is it a obviously there needs to be something that I can tell my friend about that we can get excited about. So like, what is that thing?
Yeah, I mean, we see models around this. So last year, the Zambian elections were fundamentally changed because there was a movement of individuals that was grassroots that said we want to change the political dynamic and change the elections. We saw the model work in Brazil as well, of civil society in particular being mobilized against the right. We're seeing these types of organic mobilization in the almost as a response to the 2010s of the rise of the right across the world, that it's not necessarily the rise of the left in response, but it's the rise of grassroots mobilization. And that's purely around, we fight amongst each other about petty things far too much when there's a big evil that's stopping all progress. So you see those models, so whether it is Brazil, whether you're seeing that, like I said, in Zambia, there's interesting things happening in Scandinavia, but they're too perfect apparently for us to pay attention to them. But people are showing us the models. Sometimes they work, sometimes they fail. The umbrella revolution in Hong Kong worked for a moment until it was repressed, but it gave that opportunity of what a model will look like. So that's what I kind of see it as, and I think there's scope within the country for that if it is resourced enough and people are focused on creating this kind of collective idea. It's my best guess.
Can
Of course.
Yeah, a renewed freedom charter. And I just want to add to that in kind of answering this question around the type of leader. So I agree that there's a movement required, right? But I also think there's like execution required. We've built too many movements around dreams, and there's been no like deliverance of execution to keep the dream going, right? And so while we talk about maybe it's not a specific individual, maybe it's a movement, for me the thing that rings true is like, can we deliver some runs? And like you say, there's alignment, there's many things we can argue about as South Africans. There's also many that we are all actually in agreement with. If we agree on even 10% of the issues on the table, and we do something about those 10% to the point where people are inspired and believing again to move on to the next 10%. I really think that there's something there. South Africans are all about the movement, the collective, the hope. I mean, we hope defying logic sometimes, right? And then we're asked to hope again. And there's general fatigue and disengagement with that. And what we actually need, I would dare say, is the boldness of conviction and the conversion of like implementation that actually results in a difference to then bolster the energy to go after the next thing or the next problem. So I would agree with that movement thing. For me, it's another movement. Can it be a movement with execution, lying right next to it? If we're going to, I do a lot of stuff in the entrepreneurship space. And you say like, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. If the same output metrics are still saying SMEs are failing, are still saying there's insufficient funding going where it needs to go, are still saying like there's no difference being created from a job skills perspective, no matter what level of hype, hope I can build up in people, those metrics matter because they actually hit someone in the real time as to whether a difference is made in their life. So I just want to add that dimension to agreeing with movement, agreeing with not one single individual, agreeing with the collective of leaders that make a move for change. But can there be a move? Yeah. Can there actually be a move?
I mean, if we're speaking about people working together, sometimes we're seeing political parties from very different viewpoints coming together and saying we're actually going to work together, we're at a crisis phase, and we're going to set aside our differences to move forward. This isn't always very successful.
It isn't. And I think because party politics is based on the idea of a leader. And so even when you come together through, say, a coalition agreement or something, you're already preempting what you want the result to be. And I think people are tired of that, because if you can see that so-and-so is going to lead and we know their track record, we know what they've not been able to accomplish in our spaces, then why should we even trust a coalition agreement or a power sharing agreement? If we look across the metros, I think since about 2017, if I'm not wrong, we've seen how coalition agreements have collapsed in our very own city. And so for me, it's not about not only what type of leader, but how that leader can unlock responsiveness within the institutions that are important for getting to where we want to get to. So in my experience, there are a lot of committed people across different sectors, including government. We must not think that government is completely incompetent. People who wake up and go work in government departments every single day do not struggle with laziness. They struggle with the way that they're responding, being blocked by corruption, being blocked by party factionalism, being blocked by levels of harassment, which, to be honest, we haven't begun to deal with. And then when we see how those people try to push and how they become whistleblowers and are even assassinated, it proves that there's a level of responsiveness and competence which is just being trampled on. So whether it's a leader or a coalition or a movement, my question is, how will they unlock the responsiveness or the action that is there, and keep those who are at the top of the bottleneck accountable for some of their actions or a large part of their actions. So responsiveness really is what we need. We need to listen to those in government who have been saying that these are the problems, this is how we're trying to fix them, but when we get to a certain point, this is how we're stopped. We need to hear how grassroots movements are struggling even on the ground, because some of their action is actively being stopped. And we read about this in newspapers every day. It's not a secret. But also then we need to protect those who are responding to these crises and whose lives are at risk or in danger because of that. So for me, the responsiveness and, again, like you said, the accountability that comes with listening, acting and being responsive is very important.
I mean, if you're raising the fact that there are people who are capable, people who care in all sectors of the country, but there's an active blocking and there's an active challenge against people who want to move the country forward, what's to be done? And that's quite scary.
Yeah, you know, it's really fascinating listening to all of this. I think there are two ways to address the question. The one, obviously, is what kind of leader are you looking for? I think you've set that out. On that particular score, just from our own experience of running big companies, I think people appreciate decisive leaders. You know, where you, even if you're on the wrong side of the decision, you know where you stand. But no vacillating and endless debates and conversations. I find that people tend to respond more positively to that than sometimes you think when you don't make a decision, you haven't made a decision. You know, not making a decision is a decision. So there's that aspect of leadership that I think is important. But I do think leadership style becomes a big issue as well. And what I mean here is, I think a confident leader surrounds themselves with the best people. And so I feel that when you're looking at a leader, a proxy for their leadership is who is around them. So with South Africa's many problems, We look at who is around, who is dealing with these issues. Okay, are we using the best skills, the best engineers, etc.? So I think leadership style comes into focus, and in our society, where we don't really have an appetite for big man syndrome here. I don't think South Africans have that, right? That team becomes very important, because through that team, we all feel involved, engaged, and agency and ownership, because we see ourselves, we see people that we have confidence in, and it may not be the leader specifically. So I think that team dynamic in our society is very important.
So I think I'd like you to also respond to that and just think about what to do when there's an understanding of the challenges that there are in the country. I feel like we've solved a lot of problems here in this room. There's an understanding of the challenges, but then there's also an understanding that there are very real blocks to progress. How do you get over that, especially when there's a concerted push sometimes, as Dr. Tilenga Botau was saying, to stop that progress?
Well, I think that's linked to a lot of the way that the conversation has already unfolded. And I think part of what we are called to do right now is fashion some kind of new consensus that no one has fashioned before. And if we're talking about leadership and we're talking about where we want to go, whether it's a leader or leaders or a collective, some kind of new consensus which excites people, but not just excites people, which people believe could be achievable, needs to be fashioned, that they can be mobilized and rallied around. And I think once you craft that, the obstacles tend to, the appetite to achieve that is greater than the obstacles that can be placed in that thing's way. But what I think we haven't done in South Africa is actually fashion that consensus. We think we have a consensus. It seems to me that that consensus is fraying and decaying at the moment. And so what we really need is a collective to come together to chart what a new future would look like. A future that goes beyond 1994, by the way. I don't think 94 is the high watermark of what we can achieve as a country. I think we can do even more than what we achieved in that consensus. But to concur with Roger, what I think was interesting in that moment is that everyone was prepared to come around a table and say, let's put all the assumptions aside and try to build something from scratch. And I think we're at that point, to be honest. Like, we need to think so deep about our assumptions and build from there, because one of the problems I think we're facing is we're relying on old assumptions in the face of new problems. And so I think the obstacles, there's this phrase, and I'll end here, that often instead of trying to make a problem smaller, like what are the individual things that we can solve here, you actually need to make it bigger. And once you make the problem bigger, then many of the smaller problems resolve themselves because you've reframed the problem in an appropriate way. So in order to get around some of these obstacles, I think we need to make the problem bigger and craft a new consensus which challenges and is different from the current consensus.
What would that new future look like for South Africa? What are the new goals? What are the new ambitions? What's the new, I don't want to use the word 1994, what's the new future that works for everyone in South Africa?
I deeply believe South Africa has to have a second republic. And it's predicated on the idea that a first republic was created, and we've run it for 30 years. And what was designed in 1994, they are just unforeseen circumstances that happened, some unintended consequences, and governance then needs to change. And sometimes the republic needs to change. And a really good example, so Parliament is now going to deliberate around electoral reform. So when you think about the PR system that we have in the country now, it's a complete political compromise. It was a system that was created for that moment of 1994 of we need to ensure that everyone is represented and has a seat at the table. We are now seeing that that system is flawed because it detaches politicians from citizens as well. There's no direct contestation between the two because it's a closed list PR system, which is wild. When you look across the world, no one does closed list for this very reason, because it gives too much power to political organizations. That's a republic change. That is you saying the electoral system from the First Republic has not served citizens. We can change this. Another one is maybe not an intervention, but reframing the way we think about the state. I don't think the South African state has like fundamentally changed its logic from apartheid, right? Because if it had fundamentally changed its logic, you wouldn't have people building RDP houses in the outskirts of cities as a normal occurrence of governance. You wouldn't have a situation where if you're black in this country or a person of color, you'll most likely be in poverty or you'll most likely be unemployed. That's a systemic thing that the state has not fundamentally changed. And the question then becomes, well, what's happening within the state that's perpetuating this legacy? That's a conversation. It's a hard conversation. It's not to say 1994 didn't give us freedoms. The fact that we're all sitting in this one room is an amazing aspect of the First Republic. But to believe that the First Republic would have solved every single fundamental issue, I think is the wrong logic. And I think this notion of consensus is asking the questions of, okay, we did our best. We got everyone equal rights. Everyone has the right to vote. We solved that issue. But now we have unemployment, systemic inequality, systemic unemployment, gender-based violence, the four threats that I think are the biggest in the country. Haven't even talked about the environment in any particular way. What do we do with the Second Republic to now solve these new issues that are more systemic in nature? So I would formulate it around not assuming that the state is fundamentally new, but asking what are the legacies that are still entrenched within our society, and how do we now address it on the basis of equal rights, self-determination, everyone has the right to vote.
I mean, if we speak about the challenges that we have as a country, you cannot solve, and this is something that's often repeated, you cannot solve 30 years of colonialism, apartheid, structural inequality, and very clear, very efficient ways of discrimination. And so is it a more time issue? Is it a more action issue? Is it a more collaboration issue? Because I think everyone understands the challenges that are in South Africa. But time, that's an issue.
So just try and build on that briefly and say that when we talk about the new consensus, people are often a bit scared because it's like, ooh, people have challenged the constitution, and you might be playing into a right-wing populist agenda. And make no mistake about it, that agenda exists in South Africa. But I think often we have ceded ground to that agenda to come up with new and innovative, even if terrifying proposals. And just our response is, no, let's go back to what we know. And for me, that new consensus or the new way forward would need to be these simultaneous sweeping moves all at once. Because part of the problem with the crisis is that if you just solve unemployment, well, poverty is going to come and get you. But if you solve poverty, then unemployment will come and get you. If you just look at education, healthcare is going to come and get you. So there needs to be this simultaneity of action. So somehow when a new government comes in, and sadly the only time we've seen this really is with the apartheid government, because 1948 they were like, we're legislating 17 different things tomorrow. It has to be this simultaneous set of actions which are both deep and structural and will take a long time, and that people will feel tomorrow, some of them. Now, I have absolutely no idea exactly what that combination is, but that's what we're solving for. What does that suite of actions look like?
This is starting to get to a question I had as you and Khotsi were speaking, and I think the moderator also mentioned this point now, that we kind of understand what the challenges are and that there is this need to actually kind of get on with it now and do it. But the question I was having while you guys were speaking is, what is the body through which that happens? Like, what does it look like in practice? Is it like a task team? That can bring in McKinsey again and ask them to sort this out for us? But I mean, genuinely, just like, where does it, presumably at some point the conversation needs to be had around, okay guys, Monday we're going to do this, this and this and this. Is that in cabinet? Is it in Parliament? Is it in some other, government, civil society, private sector alliance that, where a body can form a movement. I don't know practically where it happens.
I think, Roger, you'd be very well placed to come in here. You've got experience as a DG in government, you've got experience in the private sector, and now you've stepped away from the board. You said you want to see what to do. I mean, maybe give us insight into how you see that working.
Yeah, well, thank you. Look, I think it's not simple, as you've said, right? But the starting point has to be, how do we put the best people together to begin to address some of these questions? That's the starting point for me. And precisely because of the journey I've walked, I feel that I think I know which questions to ask and where to. I think so, I may be wrong. But I would take water, for example, or public hospitals, which is very close to my heart. I grew up, I used to go to the Coronationville Hospital, which is now Reimagining Hospital. It's in the news all the time, right? It's a shell of what it was even 10 years ago. So how do we begin to fix those things? So in my simple mind, fixing the state is a big part of this task, because the posture of policymakers to expertise will influence the outcome, right? So if you have a posture where you basically at war with your business community, with your intelligentsia, with your professionals, it almost systemically means that you can't draw on that. And these are patriotic South Africans who want to be part of the solution. So I think for some of these short-term interventions that we need, and I mean, okay, you said, okay, 30 years, is it time? There are other countries that have fixed things in a shorter period of time, simply because the state, working with other sectors of society, tackled those issues, and there are a myriad of examples. We just need to put our best foot forward, I think, as South Africans, and that means that we come out of our corners. 2024 and beyond is going to demand a less ideological approach to solving some of our problems. So, to put it simply, how do we get the job done? And that will be a big focus of mine. But I'm very keen to hear from all of you on how you see this interplay, because we do know that the state's been hollowed out. There's no capital, there's no expertise, etc. I agree with you, Cesar. One of the important things we must not lose sight of as we start to fix things is how do we rebuild state capacity, right? And part of that rebuilding is to make sure that those honest public servants, and I agree with you, I don't buy the sweeping condemnation of public servants, okay? There's a problem. If you go into the public service, you will find a lot of frustrated public servants who are overlooked, frustrated, and I think part of this project is to empower them to be part of this solution, because they're waiting to break through also. So the dysfunction in our governance is affecting the public service, it's affecting service delivery, it's affecting the way citizens relate to the state, that disempowerment. And I don't want to make it sound as a simple solution, but my overarching view is that we are only going to solve this together. So we need to step into a mindset that says things are crumbling. How do we solve for it today? And what is it going to take for us to solve for it today?
Thanks so much all for your time and insight today. Really good to hear from you about the challenges that you see in South Africa, and more importantly, the solutions and the opportunities that are there. And thanks to you for watching.